Metacognition. Metacognition. It's an important term. It means cognition of cognition, which means I'm watching my thoughts. I'm noticing my thoughts. And ideally, we want to have mindful metacognition. So I watch my thoughts, like my mind's chattering away, right? I'm the witness to that if I'm using metacognition. So I'm noticing these thoughts, my mind's chattering. And that is step one in taking control of the thoughts, right? Because if we don't even notice the thoughts, the tendency in our culture is, guess what? Our minds just chatter away and we self-identify with the thoughts. That's me, those thoughts are me, blah, blah, blah. That's that chattering mind, blah, blah. It's like, once we begin to learn metacognition, we learn, no, I am not my thoughts. And that's empowering. When we realize that's not me. These are just old, a lot of these thoughts, a lot of my mind chattering is just old habits, old patterns of thinking, coming from my beliefs and my interests and my memories. Well, once I notice that, and I become skillful at mindful metacognition, and I should mention that metacognition can be seen as just the king and queen of all mindfulness practices, because it's something you take with you everywhere. You can notice your thinking just throughout the day. Notice your thoughts. Because the idea is, if we're not in charge of our thoughts, guess what? Our thoughts are in charge of us. So either our old habits are going to run us, or I'm going to watch these thoughts, and when the thoughts are unproductive, perhaps, like negative self-talk, I'd consider that unproductive. I notice it, label it, metacognition, label it. Oh, that's that old unproductive negative self-talk thing. And I'm like, bam, I quiet it down. And at that point, I am in charge of my thoughts rather than my thoughts being in charge of me. And at that point, I am empowered. And as far as psychology goes, that feeling of empowerment is really key to mental wellness, or one of the keys for sure. It's feeling empowered. And it all begins with it can start with metacognition. That process of empowerment. Noticing mindfully, labeling it, that old unproductive thought. And then I'm either going to reboot it, shut it up, or I'm going to re-steer it. That's another technique, re-steer it. But either way, I'm not allowing that old pattern to run my life, unless I notice it and I just want to let it go, let it happen. But at least it's up to me at that point. But the more we practice metacognition, and metacognition is something you take with you wherever you go, the more you notice it, the more you work with it, the more empowered you become, because you become more skillful. And you become more familiar with these old, because you'll notice, at least I've noticed, that a lot of the negative self-talk stuff, it's all the same. It just keeps repeating. It's like I make a certain kind, whatever, it just blooms in my mind or whatever. And it's like, so you get to be familiar with your thoughts, and you get to be familiar with the thoughts that you don't want to have anymore, So then you start working on reducing those habits, because this is all just habitual. And if we don't take on these habitual patterns, they just keep going and going and going and going and going. I mean, how many people can like hold a grudge for their entire life because it's like this habitual thing and blah, 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 you know. But we don't need to do that. We can take charge of what's going on. And for us to be effective at working with our mind, we need to be able to get into this subconscious and start reprogramming this stuff too. You know, metacognition is kind of like we're working with the conscious mind, right? Because we're consciously noticing this is happening right now. Boom, boom, working with it. Another thing we want to be aware of with our metacognition is just simply rumination, overthinking. I mean, it's really an epidemic in our culture, for sure. Just we're in this culture where most of us spend a lot of time, you know, looking at phones and watching screens, and the way the mind reacts to that is the mind, it ingests the information. It's part of your mental diet. If I'm looking at something and I'm reading it, I'm engaging with it, it's going into my mind, it's part of my mental diet, and then I shut the phone, and then my mind is processing that information, right? So it just doesn't go away like that. And the more of a emotional charge it has, that information can just stay with you for a long time, you know. So a lot of our minds, including myself, a lot of the time, I'm just ingesting information, processing, ingesting, processing, ingesting, processing, ingesting, processing. Like I get into that pattern, and in doing so, there's no time for peace. There's no space. There's no quiet in my conscious mind, right? My conscious mind is just constantly working, you know, processing, analyzing, looking at this new data. How could they say that? You know, whatever. And just, but in reality, in our conscious minds, for us to feel balanced and clear-minded, we need space between our thoughts, you know. We need space, we need quiet between the analysis, moments of analysis. And you can use metacognition to notice, oh, I'm thinking too much. I'm thinking, like, for me, I can get all wound up if I feel like I've been dissed or blah, 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 and then I start ruminating on it. So my mind is blah, 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 but I'll notice it, I'll be like, I think I've thought about that enough. You know what I mean? I've thought about that enough, and then in my mind, I'll just be like, transmutate. You know? Seriously.
To become more involved in the Heart Mind Center, join our community and explore our membership options.
Also, check out our podcast, Mindflow Radio.
Mindflow Radio.